That seat's already taken by someone important, the staff supervisor said, glancing at the tall American in uniform. Colour Sergeant Alistair Mensah had been assigned seat 1A by royal protocol weeks in advance. But when a visiting US colonel showed up demanding priority, the airline folded and quietly reassigned the British Guard, without even telling him. 5 minutes later, the entire cabin crew and front gate staff were pulled off duty. So what happened on that plane and who gave the order that flipped airport upside down? Before we reveal the full story, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you never miss stories like this. And while you're here, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The morning rush at Heathrow's Terminal 5 was just beginning when Colour Sergeant Alistair Mensah stepped through the automatic doors. At 41, he moved with the kind of purposeful calm that 15 years in the Coldstream Guards had etched into his very bones. Scarlet tunic was pressed to perfection, every button polished to mirror brightness, navy trousers creased razor-sharp down to his gleaming black boots. The tall black bear's skin tucked neatly beneath one arm had seen ceremonial duties, from Buckingham Palace to Windsor Castle, its fur still immaculate despite years of service. Gold braiding on his sleeves caught the terminal's fluorescent lighting as he walked, each thread representing decades of military tradition. On his chest, service ribbons told a story of deployments and dedication that most civilians would never understand. This wasn't costume jewelry from a theatrical supplier. This was the real thing, earned through sweat, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty to the Crown. Passengers hurrying past with their wheeled luggage did double takes. Some fumbled for their phones, trying to capture a glimpse of living history walking among them. Others simply stared, unsure whether they were witnessing pageantry or meeting someone genuinely important. A young boy of maybe 7 tugged insistently at his mother's sleeve. "Mum, is that a real guard like from the telly?" His mother hushed him gently, but her own eyes lingered on Mensah's uniform. "Yes, love." "Ah, from the palace, I think. Don't point, it's rude." An elderly gentleman near the coffee queue straightened unconsciously, his hand moving briefly toward his brow, in an almost salute, before he caught himself. Recognition flickered in his eyes, kind that comes from understanding what that uniform truly represents. Paid no attention to the stares or whispered conversations he'd been dealing with curious tourists and travellers for years, from the gates of Buckingham Palace to ceremonial events across the Commonwealth. His focus was singular. Get to Edinburgh for tonight's memorial service at Holyrood House, where he'd stand vigil for fallen comrades who couldn't stand for themselves anymore. At the first-class check-in counter, the young agent straightened reflexively when she saw him approach. There was something about the way he carried himself, not arrogant, not demanding attention, just absolutely certain of his place in the world. "Good morning, sir," she said, her professional smile warming into something more genuine. "Colour Sergeant Mensah," he replied simply, his voice carrying the crisp diction of a man accustomed to being heard clearly across parade grounds. "Sat 1A on the 0905 to Edinburgh," she typed quickly, her screen blinking confirmation against the morning light streaming through the terminal's massive windows. "Yes, all confirmed. Royal Ceremonial Office booking. Here's your boarding pass, Sergeant." She handed it over with something approaching reverence, the way someone might pass along a family heirloom. Mensah accepted it with a brief nod, not dismissive, just economical with his gestures. Every movement had purpose. "Thank you," he said, then headed toward the executive lounge with the same measured pace that had carried him through 15 years of public duty. Upstairs in the executive lounge, the atmosphere was all leather chairs and muted conversation. Business travelers typed on laptops while CNN played silently on wall-mounted screens. Inez chose a quiet seat by the window overlooking the tarmac, placing his bare skin carefully on the floor beside him like a trusted companion. He sat as he stood, perfectly upright, hands folded, breathing quietly through his nose. His posture wasn't rigid or uncomfortable. It was the natural result of years spent standing at attention for hours at a time. Businessman across the room angled his phone discreetly, probably planning to show friends back home that he'd shared a lounge with one of the Queen's guards. Mensah didn't react. He was used to being treated like a living tourist attraction. From his inner pocket, he withdrew a slim notebook bound in black leather. The pages contained neat handwriting in blue ink: ceremony, timings, contact numbers, protocol reminders. Tonight's memorial service would honor 3 Coldstream guards who'd fallen in Afghanistan, and every detail had to be perfect. Their families would be watching. Their sacrifice demanded nothing less than absolute precision. Near the reception desk, a supervisor with a sharp haircut and clipboard leaned over to whisper to a colleague. Margaret Hayes, according to her name badge, had been working Terminal 5 for 8 years and prided herself on knowing every protocol, every exception, every way to bend the rules when important people needed favors. "Quick question," she murmured, eyes flicking toward Mensah. "Isn't 1A supposed to be held for the American embassy at Colonel something or other?" Her colleague, a younger woman named Sarah, glanced at the guard and shrugged. "If the Royal Ceremonial Office assigned it to him, I'm not questioning it. Those bookings come directly from the palace." Margaret's lips pursed slightly. "Could be a mistake in the system. Americans pay good money for those diplomatic arrangements. We'll sort it if needed." She had no idea that across the terminal, in a small office marked VIP services, someone was already making changes to the passenger manifest. Nothing dramatic, just a few clicks, a diplomatic priority override, a box checked marked embassy personnel. Small adjustments that would soon have very large consequences. Mensah remained focused on his briefing notes, unaware that his seat assignment was about to become someone else's bargaining chip. The arrival of Colonel Scott Granger was impossible to miss, and that was exactly how he liked it. The 48-year-old US Army attaché entered Terminal 5 like he was leading a parade, speaking loudly enough for half the security area to hear his running commentary about British efficiency and the superior way Americans handled air travel. "You Brits and your queues," he announced, to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the departure lounge with the confidence of a man who'd never been told to lower it. "Seriously, if I had $1 for every time I stood in line at this place, I could buy that country pub in Surrey I keep threatening to retire to." His military fatigue jacket hung casually over a navy t-shirt that stretched tight across a middle-aged spread he blamed on too many embassy dinners. The duffel bag slung over his shoulder bore nameplate stitching that might as well have been, in neon lights, CS Granger US Army. A small American flag patch adorned his collar, slightly faded from what he claimed was field use, but looked suspiciously like intentional distressing. Several business travelers looked up from their phones, frowning at the volume and the casual assumption that everyone wanted to hear his observations about international travel, British queuing culture, and the superiority of American military logistics. "Back home, we'd have this whole check-in process streamlined." He continued to abuse security guard. "Digital everything, no paperwork, boom, you're through. But hey, tradition, right? Got to love the old world charm." Granger made his way to the British Airways Executive Lounge, flashing a diplomatic passport and special clearance badge that got him immediate access. The moment he stepped inside and spotted Mensah by the window, his entire demeanor shifted from loud friendliness to something sharper, more calculating. "Oh hell," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. Even in the quieter lounge atmosphere, "Didn't know we had community theatre performances this early in the morning. Where's the rest of the Renaissance fair?" A young stewardess at the reception desk tried to intervene, recognizing the brewing situation. "Sir, that's actually a serving member of..." But Granger waved her off with the dismissive gesture of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Relax, sweetheart. I know the type for costume regalia for press events and flag-waving ceremonies. I've seen plenty of them at Arlington National Cemetery guys who think standing still for photos counts as military service." He leaned against the reception desk with practiced casualness, the kind of pose he'd perfected during 26 years of working his way up through military bureaucracy. "Besides, last I checked, the Revolutionary War ended a while back. Thought you Brits might have gotten the memo about updating your uniforms. The stewardess looked increasingly uncomfortable, glancing between Granger's loud confidence and Mensah's quiet dignity. Sir, if you could just... I was told my seat was being held. Granger interrupted, turning his attention back to business. Right, Colonel Scott. Granger US Embassy detail traveling on official diplomatic business. Please tell me there's not some bureaucratic mix-up that's going to make me late for a very important meeting in Scotland. The woman behind the desk frowned at her screen scrolling. Through the passenger manifest, Sir Seat 1A is currently assigned to a royal guard travelling under ceremonial clearance from St. James's Palace. Granger whistled low, the sound carrying just enough disbelief to make his point. The guy with the fuzzy hat and the toy soldier outfit. Seriously? He leaned closer, dropping his voice to what he probably thought was a confidential whisper, but was still loud enough for 3 nearby passengers to hear clearly. Look, this isn't about comfort or legroom. It's about international relations and proper diplomatic protocol. I'm flying in official US military uniform under embassy clearance to represent American interests at a joint NATO briefing. If some guy in a Halloween costume is sitting up front while the actual military officer is stuck in coach, that sends exactly the wrong message back to Washington. The agent looked genuinely distressed. But sir, the ceremonial protocol can be flexible when real diplomacy is involved. Granger finished with a smile that managed to be both charming and threatening. Trust me, honey, you really don't want the American embassy calling Downing Street because tea time tradition got in the way of actual international relations. These costume guards are great for the tourists, but when grown-up business needs to happen, priorities need to be adjusted accordingly. Margaret Hayes, the supervisor who'd been watching the entire exchange from across the lounge, approached with her clipboard and the expression of someone about to solve a problem with administrative efficiency. After a whispered conversation with her staff and several purposeful screen taps, she made the override that would change everything. We'll handle this discreetly, she told Granger as a new boarding pass printed slowly from the counter's machine. No need to make it dramatic or embarrassing for anyone involved, just a simple seat reassignment. Granger agreed with visible satisfaction, pocketing the new boarding pass. Happens all the time in international travel. Sometimes you have to make practical decisions about who really needs to be where 20ft away. Mensah continued reading his briefing folder, completely unaware that his seat had just been given away. Not for safety reasons, not due to aircraft maintenance or overbooking, but because someone had decided that volume and self-importance mattered more than centuries of military protocol and royal appointment. When boarding was finally announced, over the terminal speaker system, a ground staffer approached Mensah with the kind of apologetic expression usually reserved for delivering very bad news to people who didn't deserve it. Colour Sergeant. I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience. She began, her voice carrying genuine regret. There's been a security reshuffle due to international diplomatic protocols that we weren't made aware of until just now. You've been reassigned to seat 7D. It's still business class accommodations. Of course. Mensah looked down at the new boarding pass, then back at her face. For just a moment, something flickered behind his calm blue eyes. Not anger or indignation, but the quiet understanding of a man who'd encountered this kind of casual disrespect before, the assumption that his uniform was just fancy dress, that his service was merely ceremonial pageantry for tourists. He didn't argue, didn't demand explanations, or threaten to call his superiors, didn't ask who had made the change, or insist on knowing why his original reservation had been overruled. Understood. He said simply, accepting the new boarding pass with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout the morning. Behind him, Granger was already positioning himself at the front of the boarding line, holding his phone high to snap a selfie with the gate number visible in the background. VIP treatment. He chuckled loudly to another passenger waiting nearby. This is just how things work when you represent serious military power instead of tourist attractions. Neither man knew that in exactly 5 minutes, one of them would discover what happened when real military protocol decided it had been insulted. Long enough. The boarding process began with the usual organized chaos of international Travel families struggled with oversized carry-ons. Business travelers clutched laptops and checked their watches, and flight attendants smiled professionally while checking boarding passes and directing passengers to their seats. When Mensah stepped aboard the aircraft, the contrast was immediate and impossible for anyone to ignore. There sprawled comfortably in seat 1A, the seat that had been reserved under royal ceremonial clearance, sat Colonel Granger. His legs were stretched wide in the spacious first-class accommodation, a glass of sparkling water already in hand, his fatigued jacket hanging from the overhead bin, like a territorial flag claiming conquered ground. As Mensah walked past toward row 7, moving with the same measured dignity that had carried him through 15 years of public service, Granger caught his eye and couldn't resist one final demonstration of his assumed superiority. "Hey there, soldier boy," he called out with a smirk that several passengers would later describe as genuinely unpleasant. "Hope you enjoy the view from steerage back there. Maybe next time try wearing a real uniform instead of something from the local theatre company's costume closet." The words hung in the cabin air like smoke from a fired gun. Other passengers turned in their seats, expressions ranging from shock to disgust. A businessman in row 2 actually winced at the casual cruelty of it. Mensah didn't respond, didn't slow his pace or acknowledge the insult. He simply continued to his assigned seat with the same measured composure that had allowed him to stand motionless for hours, while tourists prodded him and comedians mocked him and photographers treated him like a prop for their vacation photos. But the cabin had noticed everything, and the reaction was swift and unmistakable. A boy in row 3 tugged insistently at his mother's sleeve. "Mum, wasn't that man supposed to be sitting at the front? I thought you said he was important." She looked genuinely puzzled, her voice carrying far enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I thought so too, sweetheart. I saw them print the passenger manifest earlier. His name was definitely listed for first class." An older woman across the aisle leaned forward, her voice sharp with indignation. "He absolutely had that seat originally. I watched them check him in myself. What kind of airline moves a royal guard for some loud-mouthed American near?" Row 5. A young man pulled off his expensive noise-cancelling headphones, his attention caught by the unusual disturbance. "Wait, that's one of the Queen's guards, isn't it? They don't get bumped from first class. There's got to be some kind of protocol." The whispers spread through the cabin like ripples across still water, growing stronger with each row they reached. Business. Travelers who'd been absorbed in their phones looked up with interest. Families traveling for vacation found themselves witnesses to something that felt historically significant. Even passengers who didn't fully understand British military traditions recognized disrespect when they saw it delivered so blatantly. Mensah settled into seat 7D, carefully positioning his bare skin across his lap and adjusting his ceremonial saber to avoid bothering his seatmates. His expression revealed absolutely nothing. No anger, no embarrassment, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. But his stillness spoke volumes to anyone paying attention. A flight attendant passing by with pre-departure drinks stopped and frowned, leaning toward the cabin manager who was checking passenger counts near the galley. "Excuse me, wasn't that seat supposed to be for the Royal Guard? I thought ceremonial personnel had priority booking." The manager, a middle-aged woman who'd seen enough airline politics to last several lifetimes, grimaced uncomfortably. "Don't get involved in passenger relations, Michelle." The American officer outranks him diplomatically. "Someone upstairs made the call, but he's traveling on royal orders," the attendant protested quietly. "Doesn't that supersede regular diplomatic clearance? Just serve the drinks and avoid any controversy," the manager replied. But even she looked troubled by the situation. The passengers weren't prepared to avoid controversy. An elderly gentleman in row 6 stood slightly peering over the seatbacks with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Excuse me," he said to a passing steward, his voice carrying the crisp authority of old-school British propriety. "I'd like to understand why the Royal Guardsman was moved from his assigned seat." He checked in before that American officer, and I believe ceremonial personnel have established priority. The steward hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. I believe it was, security related, sir. Sometimes diplomatic requirements necessitate last-minute changes. Security. The gentleman's voice carried just enough volume to be heard several rows back. I've flown with ceremonial guards, Gurkhas and royal escorts before. They don't get bumped from first class for visiting brass, no matter how loud that brass happens to be. A woman in row 8 held up her phone showing her seatmate a BBC News article she'd quickly located. Look at this Royal Guards travel under diplomatic clearance for official duties. It says right here that ceremonial personnel have protocol priority for any travel related to royal functions. The information spread through quiet conversations and shared screens, passengers passing phones back and forth to read the regulations that clearly supported Mensah's original seat assignment. The mood in the cabin was shifting from confusion to something much more pointed. Up in row 1A, Colonel Granger was beginning to sense that his moment of triumph wasn't being received quite as positively as he'd expected. The pleasant giggling that had accompanied his prior jokes about British queuing had completely subsided. Flight attendants appeared to be avoiding his area of the cabin. The businessman in 1C made a clear effort to avoid speaking by staring out the window. Mensah sat in perfect stillness in row 7, and for the first time since boarding, Colonel Granger's assured smile started to waver a little. As the cabin whispered about protocol and respect, it hummed with underlying tension. Military soldiers on ceremonial duty carried them for precisely these circumstances, when protocol was broken and higher officials needed to be notified right away. Mensah reached into an inside pocket of his scarlet tunic and pulled out a little, inconspicuous communication device that the majority of passengers would have mistaken for an old cell phone. The device was linked to encrypted channels that bypassed regular telecommunications completely, connecting directly to military command, centers that the majority of civilians were unaware of. Mensah typed 4 straightforward words that would start a sequence of events that no one on the plane could have predicted. Seat assignment violated, proceed. Within seconds, the message arrived at Horse Guards headquarters in Whitehall via secure networks, where a duty officer with 3 decades of military experience immediately understood the ramifications and made an emergency call to the ceremonial liaison office in St. James's Palace. Protocol infraction confirmed. The palace contact informed me without introduction, adding, "Escalate immediately with full ceremonial authority." The conversation was brief, professional, and entirely conclusive. When the conversation turned to issues with airline seats and royal protocol, Neil Caster, the British Airways Director of Security and a former logistics officer with the Household Division, immediately grasped what he was hearing. This is unacceptable. With the calm authority that comes from representing institutions older than the majority of nations, the voice on the secure line said, "Let me be very clear. This isn't a complaint about seating arrangements or customer service." Caster, who had spent enough time working in military logistics to know when something had gone wrong, didn't need more information or specific direction, since this was a purposeful violation of ceremonial protocol during an ongoing royal mission that needed to be fixed right away. I'm immediately grounding the plane and dispatching a replacement senior team. The pilot's safe communication line in the cockpit had a unique tone that was only used in operational emergencies, and this will be fixed in the next 10 minutes. With a face that implied their regular trip to Edinburgh had suddenly become anything but ordinary, he nodded politely after hearing the brief, straightforward instructions. "We are holding pushback indefinitely," he declared at the director's orders. "Complete crew replacement coming aboard. Additionally, we won't budge until everything is resolved." With the sort of serene urgency that makes experienced flight teams respond immediately, he grabbed the inside phone and dialed the head steward. "Your terminal is about to give you new operational tasks. In 60 seconds, check your system. Start right away and hold off on asking questions until we're in the air." A priority message coming in caused the main communication tablet used by the cabin staff to ping gently, "New list of crew members, new guidelines for operation." 3 words in red writing that made it clear to anyone who understood the airline industry's hierarchy that the director has the authority to override immediately. The front passenger doors reopened with a hydraulic hiss that caused everyone to glance up from their phones and periodicals. with the sort of deliberate gait that denotes real power, 2 uniformed British Airways employees boarded. The 4 golden stripes worn by an operations manager signified true authority. Additionally, there was a fresh senior steward wearing the maroon epaulettes that marked him as belonging to the management team. Ignoring the low, urgent tones of the passengers, that implied someone who truly deserved it was about to suffer the consequences. They went straight to the front kitchen. Hayes, the flight supervisor who had personally approved Grers's seat upgrade and who was now standing close to the galley, counting passengers with the easy assurance of someone who thought they had resolved a little diplomatic issue, was immediately found by the operations manager, who stated in a low but unmistakably firm tone, "You're relieved of duty immediately. Collect your personal belongings and disembark the aircraft now." The implication struck her, and her face turned pale. What's happened? Terminal command will provide a full debrief when you report. Upstairs, he said, adding, "This is not a discussion, move immediately." Because there was no room for discussion, there was no discussion. Her eyes flitting between row 1 and row 7, she exited the plane with trembling hands carrying her clipboard and ID badge, attempting to figure out what power she had unintentionally provoked and why it was reacting with such quick, conclusive power. The steward took her position and went directly to row 7, where Mensah was still seated, motionless, seemingly oblivious that his single encrypted message had just provoked a response from the highest echelons of British institutional authority. "With our sincere apologies and those of the Crown Travel Office, we're returning you to your properly assigned seat immediately," the steward said softly, using the respectful tone reserved for addressing someone whose authority came from sources far older and more powerful than airline management. "Colour Sergeant," he said. As Mensah rose, gathered his stuff, and moved to the front of the plane, all the passengers were enthralled. For the first time since boarding, a hint of something resembling contentment flitted behind his serene blue eyes. Not victory or vindication, but just the realization that a universe that had momentarily tilted off its axis was being brought back into order, with the exception of the muffled prayers of a few travellers who were now relieved that they had not disrespected a royal guard, and the quiet noise of his polished boots on the carpet. The cabin was completely silent. When he arrived to row 1, Colonel Granger glanced up in a last effort to show courage. "Well, I'll be damned," he remarked, with a forced laugh that completely deceived no one. "I guess they finally figured out the costume party was more important than actual military business." The new steward's voice had undertones that made tough men question their life decisions, yet it was still absolutely steady. "Your new seat assignment is 17F, Colonel Granger. Please pack your stuff and move right away." The fact that the US has superior diplomacy truly struck Granger's self-assured belief as his face turned red. "I'm sorry, but I have diplomatic immunity and formal embassy approval. You can't just..." The steward responded that your diplomatic clearance does not supersede the rules of crown ceremony on British planes while on royal duty, without raising his voice or blinking. "You are not in a position to negotiate this. You are being transferred right now." Grers's loud self-assurance had just clashed with an authority structure he had severely underestimated, and the quiet in the cabin was so total that passengers 3 rows back could hear his quick inhalation. The cabin's inhabitants were all maintaining a cautious neutrality as they watched a man learn that volume and bluster had their limits when they came up against traditions that were centuries rather than decades old. He stood up quickly, his movements indicating barely restrained rage, and stalked toward the back of the plane, seizing his stuff with sharp motions, with no other option and no allies. Mensah returned to his rightful position in seat 1A, ritually placing his bare skin over his lap and looking out the window at the runway, with the same serene grace that he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. The silence was unbroken by any applause. Even if there wasn't a single cheer or celebration from the passengers, something had been fixed. Everyone on board realized that they had just witnessed the silent but total power of institutions that existed for hundreds of years before loud Americans and airlines diplomacy, and that something significant had been recovered. The journey to Edinburgh went quite smoothly, with Mensah sitting in his assigned seat and only accepting tea served with the kind of quiet respect that his uniform had always deserved. When they arrived at Edinburgh, the lesson in institutional authority continued. A man in a pricey dark suit stood at the gate, accompanied by British Airways officials. His lack of identification somehow made him seem more rather than less impressive. Duncan Greaves, who represented power structures that Americans seldom came across and never fully understood, was from the Protocol Liaison Office. As Greaves left first, he nodded politely to Mensah. "The colour sergeant is waiting for your official escort. The arrangements for the memorial ceremony are going according to plan." Behind them, standing in front of the terminal wall, Margaret Hayes appeared unsure and pale, as she was about to discover that disobeying strict royal protocol had repercussions that went much beyond momentary humiliation. Graves told her in a calm, resolute tone that this was the end of her assignment to provide passenger services. For reassignment and further training on ceremonial procedures, please contact terminal management. In the meantime, Colonel Granger exited the jet bridge by himself, hauling his own luggage, while Mensah was taken to an unmarked black car with license plates from the Royal Ceremonial Office. The American was not welcomed by any embassy employees. Nobody greeted or provided help. After a lifetime of presumed importance, he walked through the terminal, experiencing what it felt like to be insignificant. The terminal returned to its regular pace as the official vehicle, carrying a man who had not uttered a word, but whose silence had served as a reminder of where actual power lay in the United Kingdom, sped away in the direction of the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. However, not everyone forgot what they had seen. The gate agent, who had initially discounted ceremonial procedure in favour of diplomatic advantage, stood silently reliving the events of the previous 2 hours, and realising for the first time that some traditions deserved respect, not because of their loudness, but because they had earned it over centuries. "We moved the wrong man, didn't we?" she murmured to a co-worker. "We moved the wrong man, didn't we?" "We moved the wrong man, didn't we?" she whispered to a colleague. Somewhere in a Whitehall office, a file was closed with a single line that would have meant nothing to most people, but everything to those who understood how power really worked. Protocol maintained, dignity preserved, lesson delivered. If you had been at that boarding gate, would you have defended Colonel Granger's VIP seat just because he was American? And here's the big question. Would you have said anything? If this narrative moved you, hit the like button and subscribe to get more compelling stories like this one. Ring the bell so you never miss our daily posts. Should foreign officers ever be allowed to break British military customs on British soil? Share this video with anyone you know who believes the Royal Guard is only for appearances. Allow them to witness the interaction between loud entitlement and quiet dignity. Right now, your screen is showing our other tales from the Royal Guard. Watch one of them now, and we'll see you tomorrow at the same time with another unforgettable story that demonstrates that the most powerful voices are sometimes the loudest.